What if the most advanced survival architecture ever built wasn't made of steel, concrete, or glass, but of dirt, grass, and silence beneath your feet? For centuries, the Vikings have been remembered almost entirely for what they destroyed, not for what they built. History paints them in strokes of violence and motion raids along foreign coasts, longships cutting through grey seas, firelight flickering against stone walls, steel meeting flesh. It is a loud image, a brutal one, and it is incomplete. What history often forgets is that the same people who terrified medieval Europe also crossed the North Atlantic in open wooden ships, navigating some of the most dangerous waters on Earth without maps, engines, or shelter. These were not reckless barbarians. They were engineers of survival. They faced a world defined by permanent cold, scarce resources, and constant threat. Winters that could kill in hours. Landscapes stripped of timber. Societies where violence was not an exception, but a condition of life. And yet, Viking communities endured generation after generation without modern insulation, electricity, or centralized power. They did not survive by building higher. They did not survive by showing strength through visibility. They survived by understanding their environment so deeply that they learned when not to be seen at all. While other medieval societies raised towering halls as symbols of power, the Vikings made a different choice. They lowered themselves into the earth. They carved homes into hillsides. They wrapped their lives in soil, grass, and silence. Their greatest architectural achievement was not dominance over the land, but harmony with it. Not monuments meant to be remembered, but structures designed to last. They didn't solve survival with spectacle. They solved it by disappearing. Scandinavia, Iceland, and Greenland were never harsh by coincidence. They were lethal by default. These were landscapes where winter was not a season, but a test of existence itself. Temperatures regularly plunged below -40 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough to kill an exposed human in under an hour. Wind did not simply chill the air, it stripped heat from the body with surgical efficiency. Skin froze in minutes, breath burned, mistakes were not corrected, they were punished. Fuel was scarce, trees were few, firewood had to be earned, hauled, guarded, and rationed like food. Every log burned too quickly was a future day without heat. In this environment, survival was not about comfort, it was about calculation. Across medieval Europe, wooden buildings dominated the landscape. They worked in milder climates. Here, they failed catastrophically. Thin timber walls bled heat into the night. Roofs leaked warmth upward as fast as fires could replace it. Every seam, every joint, every imperfect fit became a doorway for death. A Viking longhouse above ground demanded constant fire just to remain barely livable. Miss one night, let one storm win, and the structure turned into a frozen shell. But the Vikings observed something others ignored. Beneath the chaos of the surface world, beneath snow, wind, and darkness, the earth behaved differently. Dig down only a few feet, and temperature stabilized. The violence of winter faded. The ground did not care about storms. The Vikings understood this not through theory, but through survival. And from that understanding came a realization that modern architecture would take centuries to relearn. In a truly hostile climate, the safest shelter is not built on the land. It is built within it. Soil is not just dirt. It is a system, a quiet, powerful machine that has been regulating temperature long before humans learned how to measure it. Beneath the surface chaos of the North Atlantic world, beneath blizzards, howling winds, and months of darkness, the earth behaves with remarkable calm. Dig down only a few feet, and the temperature stabilizes, holding steady around 45 to 55 degrees Fahrenheit year-round. Storms pass, winters rage, but the ground remains almost unchanged, absorbing heat slowly and releasing it just as slowly. The Vikings learned this not from textbooks, but from living in a world where survival demanded attention to detail. By cutting their homes into hillsides and lowering their floors below ground level, they transformed the earth itself into insulation, not added onto the structure, not layered around it. The land became part of the building. Some turf walls grew to nearly 6 feet thick, formed from compacted soil and dense root systems. These walls trapped warmth with an efficiency that rivals, and in some cases exceeds, many modern homes. Heat no longer rushed outward. It lingered. It stayed. A single hearth could now do the work of 3. Firewood consumption dropped dramatically, conserving one of the scarcest resources in the Viking world. Inside, temperatures remained comfortable, even as storms screamed across the landscape above, battering roofs and freezing the open air beyond the walls. This was not crude living. It was not desperation. It was a deep understanding of physics, expressed through earth and grass rather than equations and steel. Long before the phrase energy efficiency existed, the Vikings were already living it quietly, invisibly, and with astonishing precision. Warmth was only half the story. The Viking world was violent by nature, turned inward as often as it was aimed outward. Clans fought clans, settlements raided neighboring settlements. Power shifted quickly, and safety was never guaranteed. In such a world, being seen was often more dangerous than being weak. Visibility meant vulnerability. Across medieval Europe, large wooden halls stood tall as symbols of wealth and authority. They announced success. They demanded attention. In Viking lands, that kind of visibility was an invitation to disaster. A visible home signaled food, people, weapons, and opportunity all waiting to be taken. So the Vikings chose the opposite approach. A turf house erased what a wooden hall advertised. Within weeks of construction, grass and wildflowers began to grow across the roofs. What had once been a human structure softened, blended, and dissolved into the surrounding landscape. From a distance, villages became indistinguishable from the hills themselves. From ships approaching the coast, there were no silhouettes against the sky. From scouts positioned above, no movement betrayed human presence. Entire communities could disappear in plain sight. Enemies searched for days, sometimes walking directly across rooftops without realizing they were standing on homes. The land gave nothing away. No smoke columns, no sharp edges, no lines that suggested design. This was not accidental. It was intentional invisibility. Long before camouflage was named, long before stealth became a military doctrine, the Vikings practiced it through architecture. They did not defend themselves by rising higher or building stronger walls. They defended themselves by becoming part of the land, quiet, patient, and unseen. In a world where survival depended on knowing when to strike and when to hide, the Vikings understood a truth many societies never learned. Sometimes, the strongest defense is not being noticed at all. Hidden did not mean helpless. Viking turf houses were never meant to look like fortresses, but every element of their design carried defensive intent. Protection was woven into form, quietly and deliberately, without the need for walls that shouted strength from a distance. Most turf houses were built with a single narrow entrance. No grand doorways, no multiple points of access. One opening, carefully positioned away from the prevailing winds, and just as carefully controlled. Anyone who entered had to do so slowly, one at a time. The doorways were deliberately low. Every adult was forced to bend forward to pass through. It was uncomfortable by design and tactically brilliant. An attacker stepping inside could not raise a weapon. Their balance was compromised. Meanwhile, a defender standing just inside the threshold had room to strike. Weapons were often mounted beside the entrance, within immediate reach. One person, properly positioned, could hold that narrow passage against several attackers. The house itself became a choke point, turning space into a weapon. Even smoke, the most dangerous signal of human presence, was controlled. Instead of rising in tall, visible columns, smoke was channeled through angled tunnels that dispersed it across wide areas. What emerged was not a signal, but a faint haze, easily mistaken for morning mist. Wind, too, was engineered into submission. Entrance tunnels curved slightly before opening into the main living space. Arctic gusts slammed into these bends, lost momentum, and dissolved before reaching the hearth. The storm was stopped by shape alone. None of this was accidental. It was survival translated into geometry, where every angle, curve, and constraint carried the weight of lived experience. Long winters meant one thing above all. If food failed, everything failed. In the Viking world, hunger was not a temporary hardship. It was a death sentence that arrived quietly, long before spring ever had a chance to return. Hunting and fishing stopped when seas froze and animals vanished. Once the darkness set in, there were no second chances. The Vikings understood something modern science would not formally explain until the 19th century. Underground temperatures remained consistently cold, not frozen, not fluctuating, stable, the kind of cold that slows decay, restrains bacteria, and preserves life. So they dug deeper. Beneath their living spaces, Vikings carved out separate storage chambers designed solely for survival. Butter, cheese, dried fish, salted meat, each placed carefully in environments that stayed between 35 and 45 degrees Fahrenheit year-round. Food did not spoil quickly. It endured. These stores lasted months, sometimes years. Archaeologists have uncovered butter preserved for centuries in Scandinavian bogs, still recognizable after 1,000 years. In Iceland, fermented shark is still eaten today, prepared using the same underground conditions the Vikings perfected. Too warm, and it rots into poison. Too cold, and it never cures. The Vikings found the balance without thermometers, guided only by experience and failure. These spaces were not kitchens. They were biological time machines. By slowing decay just enough, these underground chambers stretched food across seasons of darkness, famine, and isolation. Families survived not because they were stronger, but because they understood how to pause time itself using nothing more than earth, patience, and cold. In Iceland and Greenland, forests were not scarce. They were nearly absent. Vikings arriving from Norway expected timbered landscapes similar to home. What they found instead were windswept plains, volcanic soil, and endless stone. Trees, when they appeared at all, were twisted, stunted, and unusable. In these lands, wood became rarer than silver, valuable enough to trade precious metal for a single usable beam. So the Vikings adapted. They turned to what the land offered in abundance. Turf, thick blocks of earth, held together by dense root systems, became their primary building material. It was free, it was renewable, and within a few seasons, the land healed where it had been cut. Stone formed the foundations, anchoring homes against frost and time. Driftwood, when fortune delivered it to shore, was gathered, guarded, and reused again and again. These choices created a new challenge. Turf roofs were not light. Some weighed more than 20,000 pounds, pressing downward with relentless force. One miscalculation and the structure would collapse inward, burying everyone inside. Through trial, error, and hard-earned experience, Vikings developed interlocking timber systems that distributed this immense weight across multiple support points. Load was spread, not concentrated. Pressure was managed, not resisted. These were engineering solutions born not from theory, but from survival. In the most extreme environments, even timber disappeared, and still they adapted. Whalebones massive, dense, and resistant to rot were shaped into beams and rafters. Bone endured where wood failed. Some of these structures outlasted wooden buildings by centuries. This was not desperation. It was adaptive engineering under pressure, where scarcity sharpened intelligence and survival demanded innovation rather than surrender. A Viking turf house was never meant to be finished. It began small, almost modestly. A young couple would carve out just enough space for survival, a hearth for warmth, a bed for rest, and a corner to store food. Nothing more, nothing wasted. In a world where every calorie mattered, excess space was a liability. But life did not stay small. As children were born and families expanded, the house changed with them. New rooms were not added upward or outward into the open air. They were cut sideways, tunneled deeper into the earth. Doorways appeared where walls once stood. Passages curved and branched, connecting one space to the next like arteries in a living body. Over time, entire underground networks emerged. Archaeological sites in Iceland reveal farmsteads that began with just 3 rooms and grew into complex dwellings with 11 or more chambers. These were not accidents. They were the result of modular logic, simple, repeatable solutions shaped by immediate need rather than long-term blueprints. There were no architects, no permits, no master plans drawn on parchment. Instead, design followed life itself. Generations lived together under one roof. Elders occupied rooms closest to the hearth, where warmth was most reliable. Younger adults and workers slept in cooler outer chambers, better suited to bodies hardened by labor. Children moved freely between spaces, never needing to step outside during the long, dangerous winters. This was multigenerational housing thousands of years before the concept entered modern architecture. A home that adapted, expanded, and aged alongside the people inside it. Not a structure imposed on life, but a structure that lived with it. The Vikings did not see the land as something to conquer. To them, the landscape was alive. Hills, streams, valleys, and fields were believed to be inhabited by unseen forces, land spirits whose favor could sustain a family and whose anger could bring disaster. To build carelessly was not just foolish, it was dangerous. So Vikings learned to listen before they built. They followed the terrain instead of flattening it. Homes were carved into natural slopes, not imposed on open ground. A hillside was not an obstacle, it was a blueprint. By embedding structures into the land, they gained shelter, insulation, and protection without fighting the environment itself. Gravity did the work for them. Rainwater flowed naturally around their homes, draining away without elaborate channels or artificial systems. South-facing hills were prized, not for aesthetics, but for survival. Sunlight striking the entrance brought free warmth into living spaces during the coldest months, reducing the need for precious fuel. When farms were abandoned, whether due to famine, feuds, or migration, nature reclaimed them with remarkable speed. Turf roofs softened, walls sagged and dissolved. Within a single generation, a homestead could disappear entirely, melting back into the hillside as if it had never existed. No scars remained on the land. This was not environmentalism as philosophy. It was sustainability as instinct. The Vikings built in a way that allowed the earth to recover long before the concept of sustainability had a name. Their architecture did not demand permanence through domination. It achieved endurance through cooperation. They did not try to overpower the landscape. They learned how to belong to it. Today, architects face a crisis their predecessors never imagined. Cities consume enormous amounts of energy. Buildings bleed heat in winter and trap it in summer. Climate extremes grow more violent, while the materials used to resist them become more fragile, more expensive, and more detached from the environments they occupy. In searching for solutions, designers and engineers are beginning to look backward instead of forward. And what they are rediscovering is something the Vikings understood 1,000 years ago. They are relearning that mass matters, that thick, dense materials hold heat far better than thin walls wrapped in layers of artificial insulation. They are rediscovering that Earth itself is the most reliable thermal regulator humans have ever lived within. Stable, silent, constant. They are questioning the assumption that homes must always be visible, elevated, and exposed. The Vikings proved that visibility is optional and that safety, efficiency, and longevity often increase when buildings recede rather than rise. Modern architects are also confronting the wastefulness of demolition and replacement. Viking homes were not designed to be torn down. They evolved. They expanded. They adapted across generations, changing as families changed, instead of being discarded when needs shifted. And perhaps most importantly, contemporary design is rediscovering a truth that ancient builders never forgot. Nature is not an obstacle to overcome. It is a system to work with. The Vikings did not fight their environment. They aligned with it. As the modern world searches for sustainable solutions in an age of uncertainty, the answer may not be found in taller towers or smarter machines. The future of housing may not rise higher. It may sink lower, into the ground, into the landscape, and back into the logic of survival that once kept humanity alive. The Vikings did not build underground because they feared the world around them. They built there because they understood it. They listened to the wind instead of fighting it. They trusted the soil instead of trying to dominate it. They designed homes not for a single lifetime, but for generations they would never meet, children not yet born, winters not yet endured. Their houses were quiet lessons in patience, in restraint, in knowing when to step forward and when to step back. Beneath layers of grass and earth lies a truth that still matters today. Survival is not always about power, visibility, or control. Sometimes it is about choosing harmony over force. Sometimes it is about knowing when to disappear so that you may endure. Prehistoric Shadows explores the forgotten intelligence of our ancestors, not to romanticize the past, but to remind us that human brilliance did not begin with modern technology. Long before concrete and steel, people learned how to live with the world rather than against it. And perhaps, as we search for answers to the challenges ahead, we will rediscover what they already knew. Sometimes, the future is hidden just beneath our feet.